I ask you to think again today about one of the central texts that we've looked at over the course of this semester, the famous charioteer speech in the middle of Plato's dialogue, the Phaedrus. I wanted to return to this speech as a kind of response or a further meditation on some of the themes we looked at last time from A Midsummer Night's Dream. I suggested that the play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, raises a rather disturbing question about love. It raises the question of whether the object of our romantic interest becomes interesting to us for himself or for herself, or rather, if romantic interest is something that is, in some sense, part of a larger social network, a network of imitation and of competition. Now, this would not mean that we don't love the person who we think we fall in love with, but it would change our sense of what it means that we fall in love. It might be, if the stories in A Midsummer Night's Dream are interpreted in a particular way and taken to heart, it might mean that to fall in love is simply to assume a certain position within a social network of imitation and competition. You might think that this means that you don't love the other person for himself or for herself. And from one point of view, that could be the way you describe it. But of course, if we apply this more social view of lover and beloved, not only to those we love, but to ourselves as lovers and as beloveds, it turns out that the picture of the self is very different too. It is not as if I am a real self, real defined as radically individual, undependent on any of my social relations to other human beings. As if I am a radical individualist, but the objects of my love, alas, are only nodes in a social network. Because, of course, to be consistent, we would have to apply this social view of who and what our beloveds are to ourselves, too. It may be that who we are, what makes us real, is something less radically individualist than our typical picture of romantic love would make it seem. So that while it may be true that our beloveds are made romantically salient to us, in part through relationships of imitation and competition, could it also be the case that who we are, our own sense of ourselves, depends to no small extent on where we stand in these networks of imitation and of competition? How do we know who we are? Do we know simply by looking inward at some eternal essence that nobody else can see directly? Or do we know who we are better if we take, in a certain sense, a less subjective view, a more third-person view of ourselves? If we look at our relationships to other people, how do we know what kind of, say, brother or sister we are? The very terms brother and sister are clearly socialized terms. To know what it is to be a brother or sister is already to know yourself through your relations to certain other humans. Why is it different with romantic love? Why is it that to be in love is something we expect to be able to explain more or less completely without looking at that larger social network in which we're embedded? What sort of aspiration to romantic freedom is it that makes us see ourselves in this radically individualist way, a way that seems to escape from the bonds or from the demands that are put on to us by family, by society, as the escape into the green world from a father and from a king in A Midsummer Night's Dream seems to enact? Plato's Phaedrus is another dramatic work focused on the question of self-knowledge within the context of erotic love. We remember that very near the beginning of the dialogue, in the first couple of pages, Socrates says something very odd to his young friend, Phaedrus. Socrates says that he must be forgetting himself if he doesn't know who Phaedrus is. Socrates' own model, then, of self-knowledge at that point in the dialogue is not that Socrates turns inward onto a radically individual self to know who he is. It's instead by looking outward in conversation to what he can make of Phaedrus that Socrates learns who Socrates is as well. To know who Phaedrus is an essential part of knowing who Socrates is. Socrates does not possess himself in some self-sufficient way that then he can open or close to other human beings. Indeed, it's only in his openness to other human beings like Phaedrus that Socrates discovers who he is himself. Considered from this point of view, of course, it's not the only point of view available in the dialogue. No more than the socialized sense of love is the only point of view available in A Midsummer Night's Dream. But considered from this point of view, the charioteer's speech takes on a very particular form. In particular, the part of the charioteer's speech that uses the image of the mirror and the eye begins to look a lot like certain aspects of A Midsummer Night's Dream. When the lover sees beauty in the beloved, the lover does not merely attach to that specific person, that beautiful beloved. Though, of course, the lover does attach to the beloved, but the lover also rediscovers something about himself, rediscovers something that when he's not in love, he's in constant danger of forgetting. He returns to what's best in himself, to what's highest in himself, to something that within this dialogue, as within A Midsummer Night's Dream, is understood as something divine, something sacred. This is why the language of idols, even of idolatry, seems so at home, both in Plato's dialogue and in Shakespeare's play. But what's striking about the form of self-knowledge that the lover can receive, can open to, only when he's open as well to his beloved, what's striking about this form of self-knowledge is that it is not radically individualist. It is also idealizing. The lover in Plato's Phaedrus, in the charioteer's speech, does not simply serve whatever particular mundane interests he may happen to have at that place and that time. Not at all. Instead, the beauty of the beloved pulls him out of the particularity of place and time, returns him to the world of myth, a world that's timeless and placeless. So that the self that's remembered, the self that's now embraced anew in the moment of love, is a self that's perfected, that has the pettiness of the everyday stripped from it. The vision of this particular beloved is at the same time the measure of what a true self would be. And the true self is never the radically individual self. The self that Socrates tries to remember in his conversation with Phaedrus is a better self from the self that you usually would see. Love makes you better than you usually are. But in making you better than you are, it also makes you more truly who you are. So that from this point of view, the social nature of love is not a threat to love. It's the necessary condition of the fulfillment of love. On this socialized view of love, a love that always has in it an imitation, yes, but an imitation of a higher self from what you are when you're not a lover. On this view, the connection to the other that allows you to see yourself, to create enough distance between yourself and your vision so that you become visible to yourself. This picture of the accomplishment of love is not an essentially selfish one. Indeed, it's a very challenging one. What we see at the end of Plato's Symposium is what happens when the challenge breaks down, can no longer be accepted. What happens to Alcibiades when the social nature of his love with Socrates reveals to Alcibiades a better self he could have been, but that he refuses? It causes Alcibiades to feel shame, but never to fully give up his love for the Socrates who reveals to Alcibiades not the secrets of Socrates, but the secrets of the true Alcibiades. A Midsummer Night's Dream looks much darker if it's read from the point of view of Theseus's concluding speech. Because Theseus refuses the notion that the self revealed to us when we fall in love is an idealized self, a self that challenges us to be more than we are in the everyday world. Theseus presents the work of imitative imagination in love as a work of, you might say, mere flattery of the self. As if the poet and the lover, like the lunatic, are merely creating a world in which they can be at home and in control. That's not the way that Bottom experiences the theatricality, the taking up of a part within the life of love. And it's not the way that Socrates in the charioteer speech presents the prospect of imitation, of mirroring, of seeing ourselves reflected by our beloveds. How narcissistic, in the end, is the view of love as something that we, in some ways, project onto our beloved? Is it all self-serving? Is it ultimately selfish? It's only as selfish as trying to find your best self, as being always restlessly in pursuit of it. Whether when we fall in love with somebody, we're willing to take on the project of this restlessness this constant attempt to become more perfect, more complete. Whether our beloved, whether our spouses, will always be for us a standing challenge to improvement, to a truer self-knowledge, is a difficult question. Perhaps instead we will prefer a view of love that's more like Aristophanes' speech, where we return to some original and much more comfortable sense of connection to another human being. Should our loves promote restlessness? Should they provoke us to a certain kind of shame about where we are now and a certain kind of exhilaration about what we can become? Or should love instead create a comfort zone, an enclosed world, like the world that Antoine inhabits? A world where all of our needs are met, as opposed to that eroticized world that Diotima and Socrates discover, where our needs are never met, because every movement toward meeting our needs shows to us our needs are deeper and longer than we'd ever thought before we arrive at that new point. I think of the material in this course as returning over and over again to the question of need, of neediness. Is need something to be overcome, to be removed from a life? Removed most especially by finding that comfortable person whom we can love? Or is neediness itself the experience we should seek in erotic love? Not the fulfillment of a desire, but the ever-new provocation of a further desire, a desire to be more than what we started as. For myself, I find a more Platonizing reading of A Midsummer Night's Dream more satisfying. I do not think that Theseus's rather, as it seems to me, cynical view of love and its imaginative power is Shakespeare's final word. But in the end, I think Plato's word is closer to our truths. But it remains to be said that both Plato and Shakespeare were great enough writers and thinkers that they embed in their own works a criticism of the optimistic reading of where erotic love can take us. If erotic love leaves us as narcissists, leaves us enclosed in a comforting world that we create to hold at bay the demands of our neediness and our imperfection, then the question has to be asked whether it's something we should pursue or whether perhaps it's something we should avoid. Certainly, there are other texts, there are other moments within this course where we've seen arguments that seem to raise a doubt about whether romantic love and erotic love can ever be cured of their narcissism and their selfishness. I think, in a very powerful way, The Secret Lives of Dentists can be a very disturbing movie. It can be a movie about a man, Dr. Dave, who lives inside his own head, who doesn't let the imperfections of his love life into his most true, his most radically individual self. By creating his alter ego, the Slater character, he avoids confronting something. In that respect, you might think of Othello as engaging in the same sort of strategy. Othello never breaks out of his narcissism. He is always enclosed. Does Luann Arsenault break out of her narcissism? Clearly, the moment of sexual desire that she feels for Roger when she almost commits adultery is asking to be described in the cynical terms derived from A Midsummer Night's Dream as a kind of social and empty desire, having almost nothing to do with the particular man Roger, and almost all things having to do with the particular situation of that very evening and that moment of crisis. So I do not think in the end that there is an easy answer to the question of whether our narcissism, our holding on to this everyday self, is something that's challenged by love, as Plato would have it in the Phaedrus, or if it's something that's reinforced, alas, by love. All of you will be the great experimenters in the lab portion of this course, particularly in your own marriages. And it remains to be seen, as spouses, whether you will restlessly call each other to new perfections, or whether comfort each other in the everyday selfishness that wealth and a college education can bring. And with that happy thought, the semester is over.